There's a couple things I know you're going to get into in a second, but it's the word occupation that seems to be so problematic. Pope Francis actually gave a speech, I believe, either last week or over the weekend, where he described the same exact situation as occupation, and he even got attacked from so many different circles. Why? And just not to take you off on too far a tangent, but why do you think that specific word, despite the reality of it being, why is that specific word problematic?
Well, it's problematic for people who want to deny reality. It's problematic for people who are hawkish on the issue of Israel. There is for many people, they don't even believe there is an occupation. They believe that Palestinians are the ones who are occupying Israeli land.
Yeah.
That goes into just like another whole deep issue of the whole conflict. And the other issue is, calling it an occupation, which is what it is. I mean, it's a military occupation with checkpoints, and it's a suffocating occupation. So, occupation is probably not even a strong enough word to describe the machine, the military domination that exists in an area like the West Bank. And Gaza is like a whole other kind of occupation. But that's what it is. I mean, the international community, without even getting into the details of that, the international community recognizes it as an occupation. The United States government recognizes it as a military occupation that's been ongoing for decades. But, the government in Israel is increasingly right-wing, and the right-wing elements in Israel, they don't want to withdraw. There used to be, like, most of Israel, most of the leadership in Israel used to at least talk about, in theory, at some point, two states. But the new elements that are in charge of Israel, the right-wing elements that are increasingly, some of them are even fascistic elements, they want all of the West Bank to be a part of Israel, and they want to basically annex it illegally. That's like another whole side of the situation.
In your piece, you actually pointed out that this is something that's also supported by progressive or liberal voices in the Jewish communities. Could you expound on that very briefly, and then we'll go into the conversation about the letter from Bakari?
So the issue of Israel-Palestine, for your viewers who aren't familiar, basically the issue, it's an issue of settler colonialism, if that's like the easiest way to understand it. You have one side, Israel, that has for decades since its creation has been trying to basically maximize its demographic majority, its Jewish demographic majority over an area of land that is not historically majority Jewish. So there's all these people who are Palestinians who are indigenous to this area, and what's happened is that Israel has this system. I mean, the occupation is a part of it, but Israel has been basically slowly, incrementally, since its creation, when it kicked out 750,000 Palestinians and refused to allow them to come back. Since then, it's been expanding. It's an expansionist state. And so it's been corralling Palestinians into smaller and smaller areas of their own land, and taking their land and building settlements, which are illegal settlements, Jewish-only settlements. And so that's that's the problem. That's the situation in the most basic, simple way I can describe it. And so in the U.S., Jewish Americans have been historically very, and they still are very, like they're probably one of the most liberal demographic groups aside from Black Americans, that vote Democratic. But Israel has been a very important issue in that community. And so there's been this like dynamic of, supporting a very liberal America that's multicultural, while at the same time supporting this like ethnically exclusivist state in Israel. And so you have these liberal, or at least self-identified liberal, like Jewish communal organizations and lobbying groups that are liberal on domestic policy in the U.S., but then when it comes to Israel-Palestine, they feel like there has to be a Jewish state. And in order for there to be a Jewish state, there has to be a Jewish majority. And in order for there to be a Jewish majority, you have to basically make sure that the number of Palestinians never exceeds the number of Jews. I mean, and that's where you get into like, that's probably one of the most horrible, disgusting parts of the whole Israel-Palestine situation, is this demographic manipulation. And so you have groups that are very invested in the idea of a two-state solution, because to them, they understand that if there's a one-state solution, which is kind of what already exists, it's just one state where millions of people, Palestinians, don't have rights over the people that rule them. But but they want a two-state solution so that the demographics never like change, because if you have a one-state reality, and at some point you're going to have to give rights to all the Palestinians there, and then at that point it would upend the Jewish majority. So that's why you have groups like J Street that are so invested in the two-state solution, to the point where where it's just like that's become like almost it's become like Like, it's like you always hear the mantra, two-state solution, two-state solution, even though it's like there's no realistic way of it happening. And so that's what I was talking about in my piece, is like these organizations that claim to be, liberal, but they don't care about, they want to oppose BDS. And so that's another thing, is the BDS movement calls for, giving Palestinian refugees the right to return. And so if you did that, again, you would upend the Jewish majority. And so that's why groups like J Street are so opposed to BDS, and that's why they actually pushed for language in the Democratic platform to, vocally oppose BDS.
Okay, so they were opposed to BDS, but they weren't opposed to the word occupation, according to, if I'm reading your piece correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't. Yeah, they were okay with the word occupation, but they were also okay with it not being in there.
Okay. They weren't going to fight for it.
The BDS thing was really big. They were happy with the Hillary Clinton language that ended up in the platform.
And interestingly enough, it's the BDS portion, and I guess I'm giving some stuff away here, that really caught my attention in the letter from Bakari Sellers, and specifically because of how boldly Cornel West came out in support of the BDS movement and in support of the plight of Palestinians in general, so much so that he could not endorse or vote for the platform.